On December 2nd, 2024, a report from Toyo Kezai was released and sent the Kagurabachi fandom into a frenzy. Kagurabachi would receive an anime adaptation by studio Cygames Pictures and produced through a joint production of Cygames' parent company, Cyber Agent, and Shochiku. Since then, Kagurabachi's sales have continued to rise, marking it as Shonen Jump's most successful property without an anime adaptation, and numerous pieces of information have pointed to this report being accurate. However, that was it. That was all we got. Just an announcement that there would be an anime eventually, and who would make it. We didn't learn anything about the director, the staff, or release date, or how much of the manga would be adapted and how many episodes Season 1 would have. At this point, it's been unofficially confirmed through credible leaks that the director will be Tetsuya Takeuchi, and it's highly likely that Season 1 will start airing in 2027, though we don't know when that year. As for the staff, while we still do not know who specifically will be working on the project, we do know with fairly high certainty it will be the Mizoguchi line, Cygame's strongest production line, and the one responsible for the Uma Musume Road to the Top OPAs and the beginning of a new era movie that will be producing Kagurabachi Season 1. However, the one thing we still know nothing about, and the community cannot come to a consensus about, is how much of the manga will be adapted and how many episodes Season 1 will be. However, when you begin to peel back the layers of this and look at the patterns and trends of the anime industry, one clear choice outshines all others when it comes to what is the most likely. This video will go over the patterns of the anime industry when it comes to episode counts of pacing, alongside all the possible ending points for Season 1 to determine every possibility that Kagurabachi Season 1 could be, alongside which is the most likely. Furthermore, it will investigate the trends of weekly Shonen Jump anime adaptations, alongside going over other more speculative information that could affect the final outcome. Lastly, near the tail end of this video, I will address some criticisms and points of weakness for my conclusion. With all that being said, let's get on with the show. Spoiler warning for Kagurabachi ahead, of course. Most shows are typically made up of either 1 or 2 cours, which are roughly 3-month blocks of broadcasting, meaning between 11 and 13 episodes for single cours and 23 to 26 episodes for double cours. This is primarily because Japanese TV networks operate using seasonal time slots, so if a show can't fill the entirety of a seasonal time slot, roughly 13 weeks, then the remaining time will have to be filled with either TV specials or some other show. This is pretty easy if a show is only 11, 12, 23, or 24 episodes long, since that's only 1 to 3 specials, but the more a show diverts from the standard, the harder it is for the network to adjust, which is why you don't see many alterations to the norm. However, just because single or double cours are the norm doesn't mean that seasons that are more than 2 cours or less than 1 don't exist. They're just rare. For example, Demon Slayer Season 4 was only 8 episodes, and Freeman Season 1 was 28 episodes. So shows outside the typical 1 or 2 core blueprint can happen, they're just not standard practice. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to ignore them as possibilities. Shueisha is not starting Kagurabachi off with an 8-episode first season covering only the Sojo arc, and, as the time of writing this, 106 chapters having been released, there isn't a solid ending point in the 70s or 80s to end the anime on, so a 28-episode season is out of the question as well. It's even rare that shows are produced with an episode count between 15 and 22. In fact, according to my anime list, when limiting to shows with more than 10,000 members from winter 2020 to summer 2025, only 16 out of 992 shows had an episode count between 15 and 22 episodes. This is equivalent to 1.6%, or 1 in every 62 shows in the past 5 years. The shows I'm referencing will be in the description, but for now all you need to know is all of them have either 21, 20, 16, or 15 episodes. Furthermore, only 4 of those 16 are first seasons, with the most recent one being The Eminence and Shadow, which came out back in 2022. Basically, the odds are incredibly high that Kagurabachi Season 1 will be either a single or double production, so for now we'll be working off the assumption that Season 1 of Kagurabachi will be one of those 2 possibilities. But for anyone who thinks Season 1 should or will have an abnormal episode count, I'll get back to that in the possible alternate outcome section of this video, so stick around. When it comes to pacing, I specifically mean the average number of chapters adapted per episode, not the actual amount of content covered in a story. At the moment, the industry standard for battle shonens is around 2.6 to 3.2 chapters per episode, with some shows adapting more than 3.2 or less than 2.6. For example, Demon Slayer, on average, adapts about 2.08 chapters per episode, though that number is brought down heavily by Season 4, which adapted very few chapters and added in a number of anime original scenes. When Season 4 is taken away, it's more like 2.23 chapters per episode. Undead Unluck adapted about 2.21 chapters per episode, My Hero Academia about 2.47, Jujutsu Kaisen 2.94, Dawn to Dawn 2.96, Chainsaw Man 3.1, Sakamoto Days 3.36, Hell's Paradise 3.38, Kaiju Number 8 3.57, and Fire Force 3.6. It should also be noted that first seasons tend to be on the lower side of the pacing spectrum, especially compared to later seasons in the same series. For example, Jujutsu Kaisen Season 1 had a pace of 2.63 chapters per episode, and Season 2 had a pace of 3.26. So for Season 1 of Kagurabachi, we'd likely fall a little bit on the lower side when it comes to pacing. The general idea is that a pace of 2.3 to 3.1 chapters per episode for Season 1 of Kagurabachi would probably be the range of acceptable pacing, with the quality starting to drop off the closer you get to either end. If you were to adapt less than 2.3 or more than 3.1, it would probably start to seriously impact the quality of the adaptation due to pacing issues by either needlessly dragging out or rushing content. So to start with ending points, ignoring the limitations put in place by episode counts and pacing for the time being, I would argue that there are primarily only 2 serious ending points that contain enough content for at least a single core and serve as satisfying endings to Season 1. There is also one other decent ending point, but it has a massive issue and it's not going to happen. And then there are a number of what I would call compromise endings that only really exist because of the limitations put in place by the single or double core framework. Starting off with the first serious ending point, Chapter 45, the end of the Raikuzaichi. There are also chapters 44 and 46, which are basically the same thing, just one chapter more or less, so for now I'm going to ignore those two and focus solely on chapter 45, as most of what I'm about to say about it can be mapped onto a scenario where Season 1 covers up to chapters 44 or 46. And unfortunately, it just doesn't work as a practical option when you keep in mind the prior limitations of Season 1 being 1 or 2 cores, and adapting roughly between 2.3 and 3.1 chapters per episode. At the longest possible length for a single core without any extended episodes, meaning 13 episodes, adapting the first 45 chapters into 13 episodes would have incredibly fast pacing at 3.46 chapters per episode, much faster than our established upper limit of 3.1. At this speed, a number of things would likely either need to be rushed, or at least a few things from the manga could potentially end up on the cutting room floor. So the first 45 chapters in a single core without some serious workshopping is out. At 2 cores, the opposite problem occurs. At 23 episodes, the only way you'd be able to adapt the first 45 chapters would be to have episode 1 adapt only chapter 1, and have every subsequent episode after that adapt only 2 chapters each. In my opinion, this would also be pretty bad due to how slow the pacing would be. Of course, we're nowhere near One Piece levels of bad pacing, but this would still be incredibly far from ideal. However, I will get back to this later in the alternate possibilities section. It's such a popular ending point that I had to create an entire section of the video for it. The second serious ending point for Season 1 is ending on either Chapter 59 or 60. In other words, have the anime adapt the verse from Sojo, Raikuzaichi, and the Sword Bear Assassination arcs all in one season. Now, the main reason some people don't like this as a possibility is because a lot of people considered all of Kagurabachi post Chapter 45 to be the Sword Bear Assassination arc, and they didn't want to split up an arc. The official website disagrees, but some people still hold that view, especially if they consider it as a larger narrative. But purely looking at the practicality of it, it's very feasible if Season 1 is a 2-core season. At 24 episodes, 59 or 60 chapters would be 2.46 and 2.5 chapters per episode respectively. A little on the lower side of the pacing spectrum, but a perfectly manageable situation, especially if you shorten it down to 23 episodes or extend a few scenes or fights. All in all, it'd be a pretty similar situation to Jujutsu Kaisen Season 1, which had 24 episodes and adapted the first 63 chapters of the manga at a pace of 2.63 chapters per episode. This outcome allows for 2 standard cores. It would have decent pacing, covers the first 3 major arcs, introduces a substantial amount of major characters, and would have a fantastic cliffhanger regardless if it ended on Chapter 59 or 60. Ending on Chapter 61 is also a possibility, but it's not discussed as much, so I just left it off till now. Though it could definitely happen. In my opinion, this is the most likely ending point since it checks all the required boxes, and as I'll go over in the later parts of this video, it's highly likely that Season 1 will be a 2-core season. But moving on from the serious ending points, we've got our third ending point, which, as a singular ending point, doesn't have a lot of issues. Its issues come in the amount, or lack thereof, of content and chapters to adapt. That being ending on Chapter 18, meaning Season 1 consists of only the Sojo arc, and this is almost certainly not going to happen. Aside from the actual pacing issues of this, Shueisha is not making Kagurabachi Season 1 cover only one, admittedly very good, introductory arc that barely introduces us to the world, plot, and characters. The other issue with it is pacing. Straight up, this would not work unless you wanted to create the slowest season of anime that year outside of One Piece. If you adapted the first 18 chapters into the shortest possible single core season, 11 episodes, and let's be generous and count by page counts instead of chapter counts, which makes the Sojo arc more like 20 chapters, that's still 1.82 chapters per episode. We are actually approaching One Piece pacing now. This is not a serious ending point. Now for a lightning round of what I would call compromise endings, these are basically all the possible endings if, for whatever reason, the production committee decides Season 1 was going to be 1 core with no extensions. These are the endings that could be chosen as a result, so that Season 1 wouldn't have horrible pacing, even if the ending would suck. They're all not very good, so let's just run through them. Halfway through Chapter 20, when Yuki appears, and Chapter 21. Both of these would be incredibly slow and massive hype killers for not including the Raikuzaichi. The rest of these all split the Raikuzaichi in half. Chapter 26 and Chapter 27, slowish but not horrible pacing, both end right before the great part of the Raikuzaichi arc, and the latter has a better cliffhanger. Chapter 30 would show off the initial Raikuzaichi raid, have decent pacing, and would have a massive blue ball cliffhanger with the Ashaka reveal. Chapter 36 and Chapter 37 both cover the first 2 parts of the Raikuzaichi, ending before the final fight with Kiora. The latter has a better cliffhanger, but the former feels more like a formal ending, and both would probably require 13 episodes. All of these are not good ending points. To summarize my opinion on these compromise endings from best to worst, 27, 36, 37, 30, 26, 21, and halfway through 20, and if I had to say which is the most likely, probably 27 followed by 36. Either way, it's incredibly unlikely, in my opinion, that Season 1 is just 1 core and the ending is any of the chapters I just listed out. So just to reiterate, since that was a lot, ending on the Raikuzaichi is unlikely because that would not be enough content for 2 cores and too much for 1 core. Ending on 59 or 60 would be enough content for a well-paced 2-core season, and in my opinion, is the most likely outcome due to checking all the right boxes and simply being the easy choice. The first arc alone is not enough for even a short single-core season, And there are a number of compromise endings if season 1 was only going to be one cour, all of which I don't particularly think are very good and are unlikely to be chosen unless the production committee is adamant on season 1 being a single cour for whatever reason. Another piece of evidence in support of this is the trends out of Weekly Shonen Jump anime adaptations. Specifically, I mean manga that were 1 point serialized in Weekly Shonen Jump specifically, so not counting Jump offshoots like Jump Plus or Jump Giga, though take this with a grain of salt, considering it's a pretty small sample size. When isolating manga that started serialization from 2015 to 2019 in Weekly Shonen Jump, 4 mangas had single cour first seasons, those being The Promised Neverland, We Never Learn, Yuna and the Haunted Hot Springs, and Chainsaw Man, and 4 manga had double cour first seasons, those being Demon Slayer, Dr. Stone, Jujutsu Kaisen, and Mission Yozakura Family. There was also Black Clover, that was a weekly show, so we're not really counting it in either category. And when isolating the manga that started serialization from 2020 to now, 2 mangas had single cour first seasons, those being Mashle and the Elusive Samurai, and 5 mangas had double cour first seasons, those being Undead Unluck, Me and Roboco, Witch Watch, Blue Box, and Sakamoto Days. As a general rule, there is a noticeable favoritism towards double cour first seasons compared to single cour first seasons for Weekly Shonen Jump anime adaptations, especially if they're about shonen. It also helps being popular. But before anyone says, well, what about Chainsaw Man? That was a very special case where Mappa was the sole body on the production committee and they would have been literally unable to make season 1 more than a single cour, or else the production would have absolutely collapsed because they had less than a year of production time for Chainsaw Man, and the same production line had to start working on Jujutsu Kaisen season 2, while Chainsaw Man was mid-air because they had barely 8 months to produce 2 cours because Manabu Asuka is a greedy bastard. Go watch Monaco Man production hell series. The other thing to consider is that with popular series like My Hero Academia and Jujutsu Kaisen having left Weekly Shonen Jump, ignore Modula, Shueisha's been looking for a new series to fill the voids left by them. And currently, Kagurabachi is their best-selling property without an anime. So with that considered, why would Shueisha greenlit a first season that wouldn't be 2 cours? Furthermore, if the production committee did decide to make season 1 2 cours, why would they deliberately choose to adapt less content by only adapting the first 45 chapters instead of the first 60, when the only effect it would have would be to drag out the pacing? It's pretty much consensus that the Chainsaw Man anime was kneecapped by it only being 12 episodes before getting the quote-unquote good stuff. Having seen the Reze arc movie, I'm inclined to agree, the shit was peak. And furthermore, Demon Slayer didn't even really pop off until episode 19 aired, which featured the fight between Rui and Tanjiro, which just goes to show the benefits of adapting more source material in a first season. Now, I'm not saying that both the Sojo arc and the Raikuzaichi arc aren't already peak fiction. I'm just saying that Shueisha would be much more likely to play it safe and adapt as much content as possible in case the later content sticks better with audiences than the prior content. Of course, there's always the argument that more episode will just decrease the quality anyways, as we'll need more talent and time, not budget. Budget doesn't matter. We'll be stretched thin over more episodes, but personally, I don't think that argument holds a lot of weight, and I will address it later in the criticism section. At this point, based on the previous assumptions of the 1 or 2 cour framework, as well as pacing limitations, it's pretty clear if there isn't some serious alteration to the industry norm, season 1 will likely be 2 cours and then on either chapter 59 or 60. As I stated before, 98.4% of all shows in the past 5 years have followed the 1 or 2 cour framework. But what if I'm wrong? So I came up with some valid alternative possibilities that, however unlikely, are still possible and would allow season 1 to adapt up to chapter 45 without any massive pacing issues. Just know that most of these outcomes are pretty unlikely compared to the previous 1 or 2 cour outcomes I've already gone over. These first 2 alternatives are actually not the best in my opinion, but I'm going to go over them first so I can reference them later in comparison. To start, remember what I said about shows having between 15 and 22 episodes? Yeah, imagine we hit that 1 in 62 lottery. So, just to jog your memory, for series between 15 and 22 episodes, they only make seasons that are either 15, 16, 20, or 21 episodes long if they don't follow the traditional 1 or 2 cour format. Unfortunately, they don't make 17 or 18 episode seasons, because I think that would be best if season 1 was only going to adapt the first 45 chapters, but we've got to work with what we've got. And we're also going to ignore the potential outcomes of 21 or 15 episodes because they're just inferior versions of 20 or 16 episodes. Starting off big with 20 episodes, this could work. It wouldn't be the best. It would only cover 2.25 chapters per episode, which isn't horrible. It's doable, but it's definitely on the slower side of modern shonen pacing, and would probably not be the best choice in my opinion. If this happened, the Sojo arc would likely be stretched across 8 episodes and the Raikuzaichi 12, which could lead to some episodes being slower than desired if episode counts weren't a constraint. The next option, 16 episodes, is better. It would be faster paced than most covered options so far while still being within the realm of possibility / good pacing at 2.81 chapters per episode. It would be on the faster side of the pacing spectrum, but ultimately, this is a fine result if the production committee really wanted to end season 1 off with the Raikuzaichi. You could probably cover the Sojo arc in about 6 to 7 episodes and the Raikuzaichi arc in about 9 to 10 episodes. Now that we've gotten the abnormal episode counts out of the way, let's move on to the possibilities that somehow involve adapting 45 chapters into a single cour. So get ready for some massive episode tinkering now. The main way this would happen would be with extended episodes, similar to how Demon Slayer usually has 1 to 2 episodes that are between 30 and 50 minutes long each season, with Season 3 having 2 episodes that were roughly 50 minutes long each. However, not all extended episodes are just between 30 and 50 minutes. The first episode of Oshinoko Season 1 was effectively a movie, as it was an hour and 20 minutes long, which never happens, but hey, it's possible. So, just to start, the base season has to be 13 episodes long already. This minimizes any need to extend episodes further. And our first option is the Demon Slayer Season 3 route, having 2 episodes be 50 minutes long each, be it the first and last, first and second, or last and second to last. In practice, this takes us from 13 episodes to roughly 16, which you've already heard my opinion on. The only real difference is that by cramming more content into episode 1, we might get more casual fans to stick around past the first episode, since we could get to chapter 8 sooner. The other advantage may just be having a way cooler finale, since most of the Kyoto fight would be in a single episode, and then immediately followed up by the conclusions of the Rikuzaichi arc in the same episode. If we're going off the model that the first and last episodes are 50 minutes each, then episode 1 could probably cover chapters 1 to 6, and the last episode could probably cover chapters 39 to 45, so about 2.4/2.8 and 2.8 chapters per episode for each extended episode, respectively, and a pace of 2.91 chapters per episode for the 11 episodes in between. Alternatively, you could do an episode 1 covering chapters 1 to 6, and episode 2 covering chapters 7 to 13, or episode 12 covering chapters 32 to 38, and episode 3 chapters 39 to 45. The next is the Oshinoko method, which is basically just have episode 1 be an hour and 20 minutes like Oshinoko Season 1. In this case, that effectively extends the season to, boom, 16 episodes again. So in terms of content, it would be pretty similar to the 16 episode method or the Demon Slayer Season 3 method. But damn, would it be a fire first episode to make sure casual fans stick around. Since it's basically just 4 episodes in a trench coat, you could probably adapt up to either chapter 8 if you wanted to take the slower introductory route, only adapting about 2 chapters per episode, 2.25 if you factor in chapter 1's additional length. In my opinion, that's unlikely, since it would put some strain on the rest of the season, forcing the subsequent episodes to cover about 3.08 chapters each on average, and it would cause some whiplash for pacing when we go from the slow and methodical 2 chapters per episode to 3.08 each episode after. The other possible outcome for the Oshinoko method is episode 1 covers the first 10 chapters, which would cover all the introductory parts, plus Chihiro vs. Sojo round 1, which I think would be the best and sure to rope people in. This would pretty much keep pace with the series, adapting about 2.5 chapters per episode in that episode, and 2.75 if you account for chapter 1 again, and then 2.92 for the subsequent 12 episodes. In my opinion, this would be the best outcome if they chose the Oshinoko route, but that's just my 2 cents. The next is a bit of a fusion between the two, which is incredibly unlikely, but I'm sure Shueisha could do it if they were absolutely adamant about it, and that's to have episode 1 be an hour and 20 minutes, and the final episode be 50 minutes long, basically making season 1 have 17.5 episodes worth of content. In this scenario, episode 1 would probably cover chapters 1 to 10, like with the original Oshinoko route, and then have the final episode cover chapters 40 to 45. This would have pretty perfect pacing at roughly 2.57 chapters per episode. If you wanted it to be a little faster, you could make the final episode 40 minutes long instead of 50 and cover only chapters 41 to 45, resulting in roughly 2.65 chapters an episode instead. This is pretty much the maximum amount of content that can be fit into a single core. Hell will freeze over before we get 2 Oshinoko-style movie specials in a single core season. Once again, that was a lot, so I'll quickly summarize again real quick. Most least likely goes 13 episodes with 2 50-minute specials, 13 episodes with an Oshinoko special, 16 episodes, 20 episodes, and then 13 episodes with an Oshinoko special and an additional 50-minute special. From best to worst, in my opinion, would go Oshinoko special with an additional 50-minute special, followed by 13 episodes with an Oshinoko special, 13 episodes with 2 50-minute specials, 16 episodes, and 20 episodes. And let me say again, all of these are still pretty unlikely. These are all just the plausible alternatives if the production committee really wants season 1 to end on chapter 45. I'd still bet on 24 episodes going up to chapters 59 or 60 over any of these. However, I would say that 13 episodes with 2 50-minute specials could possibly be more likely than any normal single core season ending midway through the Rikuzaichi. I'm sure Shueisha could pull some strings to get it done if they really didn't want season 1 to be 2 cores or adapt the Sword Bear assassination arc. Not happening, at least with the content we currently have. But there is a minuscule chance, and I already made an entire section dedicated to working out how the anime could end on chapter 45, so here we go. You could turn some arcs into movies, ideally those that are under 20 chapters. If you wanted to do only movies, you'd need to split it up into chunks like this. Chapters 1 to 18 for the Sojo arc, 19 to 30, and 31 to 45 parts 1 and 2 of the Rikuzaichi arc, since it's too long to be its own singular movie, 46 to 59/60 for the Sword Bear assassination arc, and 60/61 to 74 for the initial Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel arc, ending on Samura's arrival. Following that, you could do a movie covering chapters 75 to 86, covering Chihiro's battle with Samura and the start of the Kaminabi raid, ending with Samura joining Chihiro, and 87 to 101, covering the rest of the Kaminabi HQ raid, ending with Yura being teleported outside to fight Chihiro and Samura. Alternatively, if the production committee really wanted to have a canon movie alongside the normal TV show, like the Raise arc, Mugen Train, or Infinity Castle movies, then they could do a 12-episode per season, ending on either chapters 27 or 30, and followed up with a movie covering chapters 28 to 45 or 31 to 45. But that would be the most blatant cash grab ever. And the other possibility that comes to mind of having a canon movie would be a season 1 only covered the first 45 chapters, and then followed up with a movie covering chapters 46 to 59 or 60. Or alternatively, if season 1 is 2 cours and adapts up to chapter 59/60, then they might do a movie covering 60/61 to 74. However, both of these are probably just as unrealistic as the first possibilities. Most likely, any arc that will be adapted into a movie has not been written by Hokuzono yet. Recap movies are also always a possibility. If you want a more in-depth analysis on this, go watch Calkin's video on it. It's an amazing video that covers way more stuff than I have the time for. She did a great job. I swear I wrote most of the section before that video released. One of the main criticisms lobbied against season 1 being 2 cours, which I mentioned before in the Golden Goose section, was that more episodes would likely lead to production issues and the anime being lower quality as a result. There are 3 main things that determine how good an anime looks. Budget is not one of them. Most shows have relatively similar budgets and they operate on a per episode basis. The 3 things that really matter are the director, the talent/the staff, and time. The main thing I'm focusing on here is time. Cygames Pictures has a pretty good track record when it comes to production schedules/how much time they give to their staff to work on their projects. For example, Umusume Cinderella Grey Cours 1 and Apocalypse Hotel finished production either early into airing or before they started airing. This was mainly because the respective animation production pipelines that produced them had to start work on Cinderella Grey Cours 2, and the summary car died immediately afterwards. However, considering all the projects just listed didn't have any serious production issues, it can be inferred that their scheduling and production planning must have been pretty good. This is pretty uncommon in the anime industry, where a large number of shows are worked up on until the final days, if not hours, before the final episode airs. The other thing that needs to be reiterated is that Cygames' parent company, Cyberagent, is one of the big names on the production committee, which decides when a show airs and how much production time it gets. Considering they want Cygames Pictures to become a big studio like Mappa or Bones, it'd be pretty self-sabotaging if they picked up Kagurabachi with the intention of it being their big breakout hit like Jujutsu Kaisen with Mappa, only to hand Cygames a single year's worth of production time to make it 24 episodes, when there's really nothing forcing them to do so. Just because a show has more or less episodes doesn't mean it will look worse or better. Production times are adjusted to fit how large a project is. So just because a show has 24 episodes doesn't mean it will look worse than if it had 12 episodes. If it had 12 episodes, the production committee would likely just cut the 24 episode schedule in half, and the only thing that would change would be how early you'd get the first 12 episodes. That's not to say it's all sunshine and rainbows. Production committees tend to err on the side of getting a show out as soon as possible over production quality. So having a 2-cour production could likely lead to a greater strain on production, leading to a worse product. But it likely wouldn't be as bad as it's often made out to be. The other common criticism lobbied against season 1 of the anime, including the Sword Bear assassination arc, is that it would adapt too much of the manga, which would in turn cause future seasons to either be delayed or force Hokuzono to rush the story. And this just isn't an actual concern if you do the math. But let's roll with that first assumption. As of the time of the script being finalized, it's almost 2026, and we still don't have an official announcement yet, so I think it's safe to say the absolute earliest the Kagurabachi anime starts airing is winter 2027. So let's say episode 1 airs on January 9th, 2027, roughly the start of the winter season, and season 1 is 24 episodes, adapting up to chapter 60. Typically, shows get renewed for subsequent seasons after or near the end of the current season, and don't start production until after the season is over. But let's say for the sake of this being a worst-case scenario, it somehow gets renewed for a second season after the Sojo arc concludes. So, roughly episode 7, i.e. on February 20th, 2027. Let's also say by some miracle, Cygames managed to complete the entire production of season 1 by that point, so it's up to the director to immediately start deciding what goes into each episode and start storyboarding, which would mean that the current amount of chapters is all they have to work with. Assuming Hokuzono doesn't take a single break from now till February 20th, that would mean Kagurabachi would have a little over 160 chapters by that point. But let's say he takes 15 breaks between now and then, which is roughly a break every 4th week. That would mean that there would be over 145 chapters for Kagurabachi released at that point, with 85 not being adapted. 85 chapters is more than enough to make a 24-episode season, and that's in a worst-case scenario where season 1 starts airing in winter 2027, and a second season is miraculously greenlit and storyboarded 7 episodes into season 1. Under a scenario where season 1 starts airing in the spring 2027 season, and a second season is greenlit the day the final episode of season 1 drops, roughly early September, at that point there would be around 190 chapters, assuming no breaks, which is more than enough content for a season 2. Even if he took a break every 4th week, there'd still be over 170 chapters out, with over 110 not being adapted. So, this criticism holds little, if any, weight when you dig into the math, and it would not be a question weighing on the production committee's mind. The final point of opposition usually brought up is that Cygames Pictures, so far at this point, aside from Umusume Cinderella Grey, has only produced single-cour shows, and so therefore, it would be unlikely for them to make Kagurabachi a double-cour season. That's a fair point, but it's important to remember that it's not really the studio's choice if a season gets 1 or 2 cours. That decision falls to the production committee, so Cygames' record likely wouldn't play much of a factor here. Then again, Cygames' parent company, Cyberagent, is one of the leaders on the production committee along with Shochiku, so make of that what you will. So, to put a nice little bow on everything, the first season of Kagurabachi is not going to be a single cour because it will have a terrible ending and not even cover all of the Rekuzaichi arc. It's unlikely that season 1 will only cover the Sojo and Raikuzaichi arcs, as it would either require a single core with a lot of episode extending, which is unlikely to happen, or would need an abnormal episode count, which is even rare. So this would only happen if the production committee was adamant about making season 1 cover only the first 45 chapters. The most likely result for season 1 would likely be a 2-core production ending on chapters 59 or 60, because it would not mess with any industry norms and allows for comfortable pacing. This is supported by Weekly Shonen Jump adaptation trends, as well as the fact it would be unlikely Shueisha would want their next big property to be gutted by not having a sufficient amount of content, and canon movies just aren't going to happen, at least not yet with the current source material we have access to. If you've made it this far, to be honest, I'm a little surprised you're still watching. That's pretty much everything. I'm just going to assume you've absorbed all that info. I just want to say thank you. This is my first ever video essay I've had to write a whole script for, and the first video essay I've had to do some serious editing for. Though I'm pretty sure Josh in between are handling most of it. Thank you, Josh. This video took a lot of time and effort, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as a lot of this research, such as the research done on episode counts and pacing, was just done in my free time so I could push the 24-episode agenda on Reddit and Twitter. I'd like to throw a shout out to Weeb, Alonzi, and the OG Daffy as content creators for inspiring me to finally make this. If you like the video, leave a like. If you want to share your thoughts on the eventual anime or on this video, leave a comment. If you thought I missed something, leave a comment as well. I compulsively read all the comments under anything I post online, so you can be sure I'll probably read whatever you have to say. Alright, that's all I've got. See you another time. I'm out.